I froze in the doorway of my parents' study, my hand still on the doorknob. Through the crack, I saw my older brother Dominic leaning against father's desk, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Once Mom signs this revised trust document, the $27 million is all mine," he said, holding up a folder. "Frankie doesn't even suspect you're cutting her out." My father nodded slowly, avoiding the direction of the door. My mother sat in the leather chair by the window, silent. The words hit me like a physical blow. My heart pounded so hard I thought they'd hear it. $27 million. My inheritance from grandmother Tate, who had specifically left it to me because I was the one who'd cared for her in her final years. I stepped back silently, my hands trembling. My name is Frankie Tate, and I had just discovered my own family was plotting to rob me blind. The betrayal felt like ice water in my veins, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. Not yet. I barely made it to my bedroom before my legs gave out. I sat on the edge of my bed, shaking, clutching my grandmother's locket that hung around my neck. The same grandmother who had trusted me, who had made me promise to use the money wisely. Downstairs, I heard Dominic's laugh echo through the hallway. It was the same laugh he'd used when we were kids and he'd gotten away with breaking my toys. My mother called up the stairs, "Frankie, dinner in 20 minutes. Her voice was light, casual, as if she hadn't just sat there planning to steal my future. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes red. But underneath the shock, something else was building. Not just anger, determination. They thought I was naive, easy to manipulate, too sweet to fight back. They had always underestimated me. That was going to be their biggest mistake. I wiped my eyes and straightened my shoulders. I wouldn't be the victim in this story. I would be the strategist they never saw coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how we'd gotten here. Dominic had always been the golden child, charming, ambitious, father's pride. I was the quiet one, the peacemaker, the daughter who visited grandmother every Sunday when Dominic was too busy. When grandmother got sick, I was the one who held her hand through chemotherapy. I was the one who moved into her guest room for 6 months to care for her. Dominic visited twice, both times asking her about her estate planning. I remembered the day grandmother told me about the inheritance. "You have a good heart, Frankie," she'd said, squeezing my hand. "The money goes to you because you'll use it to help others, not just yourself." She'd made me executor of that portion of the trust specifically to protect it from family interference. But apparently, that hadn't stopped them from finding a way around it. I realized now that every family dinner over the past 6 months, every casual question about the trust, every suggestion that I simplify things by consolidating accounts, it had all been groundwork for this betrayal. The next morning, I called the one person I knew would understand. "Ms. Lorraine? It's Frankie. I need your help." Ms. Lorraine had been my grandmother's closest friend and had essentially raised me when my parents were too busy with their social calendar. She'd taught me about finance, about standing up for myself, about seeing through manipulation. "Come to the house immediately," she said, her voice sharp with concern. 2 hours later, I sat in her sunlit kitchen, explaining everything. She listened without interrupting, her face growing harder with each detail. When I finished, she set down her tea carefully. "Your grandmother anticipated this possibility," she said. "She told me 6 months before she passed that she worried Dominic would try something. She disappeared into her study and returned with a locked box. She asked me to give you this if anything seemed wrong with the trust administration." Inside were copies of the original trust documents, a letter from grandmother outlining her exact wishes, and something else, evidence that Dominic had tried this before, years ago, when grandmother was still alive. I also called Marissa, my best friend since college who happened to be a corporate attorney. We met at a quiet coffee shop across town. "You need to document everything," she said immediately after I explained. "Every conversation, every manipulation attempt, every inconsistency in the trust administration." She pulled out a legal pad. "But you can't let them know you're aware. The element of surprise is your biggest advantage. Over the next week, I played the role of oblivious younger sister perfectly. At family dinners, I smiled and made small talk. When Dominic casually mentioned that I should simplify my finances, I nodded pleasantly. But I watched everything. I noticed how he steered conversations away whenever trust matters came up. I saw how mother and father exchanged glances when I mentioned grandmother. I observed the small tells, Dominic checking his phone anxiously, mother's tight smile, father's refusal to meet my eyes. I catalogued every moment, every micro-expression. They thought I was naive. I was actually gathering ammunition. 2 weeks after discovering their plot, I was walking past father's study when I heard voices again. I stopped, my heart racing, and listened. Dominic was on the phone with someone named Harrison, the family attorney. The new documents should be ready by next month, Harrison's voice came through on speaker. Once your parents sign them, Frankie's inheritance gets redistributed based on family need assessment. Since you're the primary breadwinner with business expenses, you qualify for the majority. Dominic laughed. Perfect. She'll never think to contest it. She trusts us. Just make sure she doesn't consult outside counsel, Harrison warned. If she gets independent legal advice, this could get complicated. My hands clenched into fists. They were planning to steal everything within a month. I felt panic rising but forced it down. Panic led to mistakes. I needed to stay strategic, stay calm. I quietly pulled out my phone and recorded the rest of the conversation. Every word was potential evidence. When they finished, I slipped away silently, my mind already racing through countermoves. The emotional toll was crushing. I felt utterly alone in my own family. At dinner that night, I watched them laugh and joke as if they hadn't spent the day plotting against me. My mother asked about my week with false cheerfulness. My father told stories about his golf game. Dominic complimented the meal. It was all so normal, so perfectly civil, and completely hollow. After dinner, I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the garden where grandmother and I used to have tea. I felt her loss all over again. She'd been my real family, my anchor. These people, my blood relatives, were strangers in expensive clothes. I called Ms. Lorraine, my voice breaking. Some days I wonder if I'm overreacting, I admitted. Maybe I should just let them have the money and walk away. Frankie, she said firmly, your grandmother didn't give you that inheritance as a gift. She gave it as a responsibility. She wanted you to have security, independence, the ability to make choices. They're not just stealing money, they're stealing your future. Don't you dare give up. I began my countermove carefully. First, I requested copies of all trust documents from the independent trustee grandmother had appointed at another bank. I discovered that my parents had been pressuring the trustee to streamline communications by routing everything through them first. The trustee, uncomfortable with the situation, was relieved when I intervened directly. Next, I documented every financial irregularity. There were several small withdrawals from trust accounts that I should have been notified about but wasn't. Marissa helped me prepare a formal inquiry demanding full accounting. The beauty of grandmother's setup was that the trust was legally mine, my parents were just temporary administrators until I turned 35, which was in 3 months. They were racing against a deadline I'd nearly forgotten about. I also quietly moved my personal accounts to a different bank and secured my important documents in Ms. Lorraine's safe. If they were planning to forge signatures or manipulate paperwork, they'd find only dead ends. Every action was careful, methodical, legally defensible. I wasn't being vengeful. I was being smart. The opportunity for my first public move came at my cousin's engagement party. The extended Tate family gathered at an upscale restaurant, champagne flowing freely. Dominic held court as usual, telling stories and charming relatives. I waited until he mentioned his new business venture, the one he'd apparently told everyone was funded by his own savvy investments. That's interesting, Dom, I said pleasantly from across the table. When did you start that business? Last month, right? He nodded, smiling. About the timeline when you met with Harrison about redistributing grandmother's trust? I continued innocently. The table went quiet. Dominic's smile froze. What are you talking about? Oh, I just thought it was coincidental timing, I said with a sweet smile. Starting a business right when you're arranging to access grandmother's estate funds. My Aunt Caroline frowned. I thought grandmother's money went to Frankie. Several relatives looked confused. My mother's face paled. I'd planted the seed of doubt without making direct accusations. Let them wonder. Let them question. Dominic stammered through some explanation, but the damage was done. His perfect image had its first crack. 3 days later, I received an unexpected call. Ms. Tate? This is Oliver, I work at Harrison's law firm. His voice was nervous. I think you should know something. We met at a neutral location. Oliver, a junior associate, looked uncomfortable but determined. I've watched Harrison help your brother manipulate trust documents for months, he said. I didn't think it was right, but I'm just an associate. I kept quiet. He handed me a flash drive. These are copies of all the drafts, emails, and strategy memos. Everything showing this was premeditated fraud. I stared at the drive, hardly believing my luck. Why are you helping me? Oliver looked down. My grandmother died last year. My uncle tried to steal her estate too. I wish someone had warned me in time. I barely saved anything. He met my eyes. What they're doing to you is wrong. I can't be part of it anymore. I thanked him, feeling genuinely moved. This stranger had more integrity than my own family. The flash drive contained everything I needed: proof of conspiracy, evidence of fraud, documentation of Dominic's premeditation. My case was becoming ironclad. That weekend, Mother finally confronted me directly. I was reading in the garden when she appeared, her face tight with irritation. Dominic says you've been asking invasive questions about the trust, she said, her voice cold. You're embarrassing the family with your paranoia. I looked up calmly. I'm not paranoid, Mother. I'm informed. There's a difference. You've always been dramatic, she snapped. Your grandmother spoiled you, and now you think you're entitled to make demands. The words stung more than I expected. I kept my voice steady. Grandmother left that money to me specifically. I'm not making demands, I'm protecting my inheritance. Your inheritance, she said mockingly. You're 34 years old, Frankie. You should be thinking about family unity, not selfish financial interests. I stood up slowly, meeting her gaze. For the first time in my life, I didn't back down. Family unity requires trust, Mother. When you destroy trust, you destroy family. I'd think carefully about who started that process. She stared at me, shocked. I'd never spoken to her like that. Then she turned and walked away. I sat back down, shaking but proud. I'd held my ground. Marissa and I spent the next 2 weeks building an unshakable legal strategy. We filed formal objections to any trust modifications, citing my grandmother's original intentions. We submitted the evidence from Oliver showing conspiracy and fraud. We requested a full audit of all trust transactions over the past 2 years. Every step was documented, filed properly, and backed by legal precedent. Ms. Lorraine provided character references from people who knew my grandmother's wishes. We gathered testimony from grandmother's doctors confirming she'd been mentally sharp until the end, removing any possibility of claims that her trust planning was invalid. I also secured copies of every email and text message I could legally access, showing the pattern of deception. Marissa was impressed. You've built an airtight case, she said, reviewing the files. Even if they try to fight this, they'll lose. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks before my 35th birthday. Perfect timing. By then, I'd have full control of the trust anyway, but I wanted their attempt on record. I wanted the family to know exactly what they'd tried to do and that they'd failed. 2 days before the preliminary hearing, Dominic made his boldest move yet. I received a notice that my access to one of the trust's investment accounts had been temporarily frozen pending investigation of irregularities. It was a desperate play to create confusion before the hearing. But I'd anticipated something like this. Within hours, Marissa filed an emergency motion with documentation proving I'd done nothing wrong and that the freeze was retaliatory. We also provided evidence from Oliver's flash drive showing Dominic had orchestrated the false irregularities claim. The judge reviewed everything overnight and not only unfroze the account but issued a restraining order preventing any further trust modifications without court approval. Dominic had overplayed his hand. His aggressive move had backfired spectacularly. When I saw him at a family gathering that weekend, his confidence was shaken. He pulled me aside, his voice low and angry. "What do you think you're doing?" "Protecting what's mine," I replied calmly. "Maybe you should have thought about consequences before committing fraud." His face flushed red. He wasn't used to me standing up to him. I walked away, leaving him speechless. Something shifted after that confrontation. Extended family members started reaching out to me privately. Aunt Caroline called to say she'd always thought grandmother's wishes should be respected. Cousin Blake mentioned he'd noticed odd behavior from Dominic around money matters. Even my Uncle Philip, father's brother, expressed concern about how the trust was being handled. These weren't my immediate allies, but they were neutrals moving to my side. Each conversation gave me more social capital within the family structure. The narrative was changing. Instead of being the dramatic younger sister making trouble, I was becoming the protective granddaughter honoring grandmother's memory. Dominic's perfect image was crumbling. At a small family dinner, Aunt Caroline pointedly asked him about his business funding. He stumbled through an answer that satisfied no one. I said nothing, just sipped my wine with a slight smile. The doubt spread naturally. I didn't have to attack him directly, his own deceptions were catching up with him. The power dynamic was shifting, slowly but unmistakably. I was no longer on the defensive. They were. The next move was subtle but devastating. Through Ms. Lorraine, I let it accidentally slip that I was considering consolidating all trust assets under new management, which was true. Dominic heard about it through the family gossip chain, exactly as I intended. Within 2 days, he made a panicked call to Harrison, the family attorney, making demands about protecting his share of the assets. I knew he would because Oliver had told me Dominic always reacted impulsively under pressure. Here's where it got interesting. I'd arranged for that conversation to happen while Dominic was at his office, where he frequently used speakerphone. His assistant, who'd grown tired of his arrogant behavior, recorded the conversation and sent it to me anonymously. In the recording, Dominic explicitly referred to the money as already his, discussed how he'd manipulated our parents, and even joked about my predictable nature. It was a goldmine of evidence. He'd fallen for the trap perfectly, letting his guard down because he thought he was safe in his own office. I saved the recording with all my other documentation. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of his scheme. A week before the hearing, I had an unexpected private conversation with my father. He asked to meet me at a quiet restaurant downtown, away from the house. He looked older somehow, tired. "Frankie," he began slowly, "I know things have been difficult." I waited, letting him struggle with his words. "Your brother has always been ambitious," he continued. "Perhaps too ambitious. I may have encouraged that." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest he'd probably come. "Did you know grandmother specifically wanted the money to go to me?" I asked directly. He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "She made her reasons clear." "Then why did you go along with Dominic's plan to steal it?" The blunt words made him flinch. "He said you wouldn't mind sharing, that you'd be reasonable about family needs." I didn't realize the extent of his intentions until recently. I leaned forward. "Father, I have evidence of fraud. Conspiracy. Forgery attempts. This isn't about sharing, it's about theft." His face paled. It won't look good for the family if this becomes public. Then perhaps, I said carefully, the family should stop trying to steal from me. The annual Tate Family Gala was a major social event, attended by relatives, business associates, and old family friends. I'd considered skipping it, but Marissa convinced me otherwise. Face them, she'd said. Show them you're not hiding. I wore grandmother's diamond necklace and held my head high. Halfway through the evening, I found myself in a conversation circle that included Dominic, several cousins, and family friends. Someone asked about grandmother's trust, and Dominic launched into a smooth explanation about family asset management and collaborative decision-making. I waited until he finished. Then, with a pleasant smile, I said, "That's an interesting interpretation, Dom. Though I wonder how collaborative it is when you meet with attorneys to restructure someone else's inheritance without telling them." The circle went silent. Or when you file false irregularity claims to freeze accounts. Or when you tell lawyers the money is already yours before any legal transfer has occurred. I pulled out my phone. I have recordings, if anyone would like to hear them. Dominic's face went from red to white. You're making serious accusations. I'm stating documented facts, I replied calmly. The preliminary hearing is next week. Everything will be on the public record. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Dominic's reputation, so carefully constructed, shattered in a single conversation. He left the gala early. That night, I sat with Ms. Lorraine and Marissa at Ms. Lorraine's house, exhausted but relieved. You did it, Marissa said, raising her wine glass. You exposed him publicly without losing your composure. Ms. Lorraine hugged me. Your grandmother would be so proud. You fought with intelligence and grace, not cruelty. The emotion I'd been holding back finally broke through. I cried, for the family I'd lost, for the betrayal, for the stress of the past months. But also with relief that the worst was over. These women, my found family, had supported me when my blood relatives had failed me. I kept thinking about what grandmother said, I told them through tears. That family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up for you. Ms. Lorraine squeezed my hand. She knew you'd need support. That's why she made sure we'd be here. We talked late into the night, not about legal strategies or revenge, but about healing, about choosing your family, about building a life on your own terms. The preliminary hearing was in 6 days. I was ready. More importantly, I knew exactly who would be standing beside me. Dominic's desperation became obvious in the days before the hearing. He called me 12 times in 2 days, I didn't answer. He sent emails ranging from threatening to pleading. He tried to arrange an emergency family meeting to discuss reasonable compromise. Each action was documented and forwarded to Marissa. His attorney, Harrison, tried to file last-minute motions to delay the hearing, but they were denied. He attempted to introduce new evidence of my supposed financial mismanagement, easily disproven fabrications that only made his case worse. On the morning of the hearing, I received a text from an unknown number, "You're destroying this family over money. You'll regret this." I showed it to Marissa. She smiled grimly. "Save it. It shows consciousness of guilt and harassment." The more desperately Dominic fought, the worse he made things for himself. His panic was visible, his composure completely gone. This was what happened when someone used to easy manipulation met real resistance. He'd never had to fight fairly before, and he didn't know how. I, on the other hand, had prepared for this moment for months. I was calm, documented, and ready. At dinner the night before the hearing, Ms. Lorraine looked at me with pride. "You know what impresses me most," she said. "You could have destroyed Dominic publicly months ago. You had the evidence. But you did everything legally, carefully, without unnecessary cruelty." Marissa nodded. "You gave them every chance to back down gracefully. They chose to escalate. Your grandmother raised you to be strong but not vindictive," Ms. Lorraine continued. "You've honored that. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice." Their words meant everything. I'd worried sometimes that I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. But they reminded me that protecting yourself isn't cruelty. Standing up to thieves isn't revenge. Demanding what's rightfully yours isn't greed. I thought about the scared woman I'd been months ago, frozen in that doorway, overhearing the betrayal. She'd felt powerless. The woman I'd become, strategic, supported, strong, knew her worth. Tomorrow, I said, we finish this. Both women raised their glasses. Tomorrow, they echoed. I slept peacefully that night, perhaps for the first time in months. I was ready for whatever came next. The preliminary hearing was exactly as clinical and impersonal as Marissa had warned. The judge reviewed mountains of evidence, the original trust documents, grandmother's letter of intent, the recordings from Oliver's flash drive, documentation of the conspiracy, proof of Dominic's false claims. My attorney presented everything methodically. Dominic's attorney tried to argue that the trust language was ambiguous, that family financial support qualified as legitimate need, that my claims of fraud were exaggerated. Every argument fell flat against our documentation. The judge looked at Dominic with obvious distaste. Mr. Tate, the evidence shows a clear pattern of deception and attempted theft. This court finds no ambiguity whatsoever in the trust language. She turned to me. Ms. Frankie Tate has demonstrated legitimate concern about trust administration and provided substantial evidence of improper manipulation attempts. The ruling was swift. All trust assets were to be frozen under court supervision until my 35th birthday in 2 weeks, at which point full control would transfer to me as originally intended. Any attempted modifications were void. Dominic left the courthouse looking destroyed. I left feeling free. Outside, Ms. Lorraine and Marissa hugged me. You won, Marissa whispered. You actually won. 2 weeks later, on my 35th birthday, I sat in the law office as the final paperwork was signed. Full control of $27 million transferred to my name alone. No more trustees, no more administrators, no more family interference. Just my decisions about my future. My phone buzzed with messages. Aunt Caroline sent congratulations. Cousin Blake sent flowers. Uncle Philip called to say he'd always believed grandmother's wishes should be honored. Even some of Dominic's former allies reached out, distancing themselves from his behavior. My parents sent nothing. Dominic sent one final email, I hope you're happy. You've torn this family apart. I didn't respond. He'd torn the family apart the moment he'd decided to steal from me. I'd simply refused to be a victim. That evening, I gathered with my real family, Ms. Lorraine, Marissa, and a few other close friends who'd supported me through everything. We celebrated not with an expensive gala but with dinner at Ms. Lorraine's house, grandmother's favorite recipes. To Frankie, Ms. Lorraine toasted. Who proved that intelligence and integrity will always triumph over greed. To found family, I added. The people who choose to stand beside you. We raised our glasses, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. The found family celebration continued into the weekend. Marissa insisted on taking me to a spa, you've earned this. Where we spent hours just relaxing and laughing about ridiculous family drama. Ms. Lorraine hosted a garden party with people who'd known grandmother, sharing stories that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to honor her wishes. One friend of grandmother's, an elderly woman named Beatrice, pulled me aside. Your grandmother told me once that she worried your family would try this. But she said, Frankie has steel in her spine, even if she doesn't know it yet. When the time comes, she'll fight. Tears filled my eyes. I wish she could know I won. She knows, Beatrice said with certainty. And she's proud. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done since before discovering the betrayal. I wrote about the pain, the strategy, the victory. But mostly, I wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for grandmother's foresight, for Ms. Lorraine's guidance, for Marissa's expertise, for Oliver's conscience, for all the people who'd chosen to do the right thing. Blood didn't make family. Choice did. Love did. These people had chosen me, and I'd chosen them back. Dominic's downfall was complete and public. Word spread through the extended family about the fraud attempt, the conspiracy, the recordings. His reputation, so carefully maintained, was destroyed. Business associates distanced themselves. Several family members stopped inviting him to gatherings. Even his former confidants admitted they'd known something was wrong but had been afraid to speak up. His promising business venture collapsed when investors pulled out, uncomfortable with the ethical questions. The luxury lifestyle he'd been planning with my inheritance never materialized. He'd gambled everything on stealing from me and lost spectacularly. My parents faced their own consequences. They weren't legally culpable, they'd been manipulated by Dominic as much as they'd been willing participants. But the family knew they'd chosen one child over another, greed over fairness. Their relationship with me was permanently damaged. I didn't cut them off entirely, but I no longer pretended we were a close, loving family. Holidays were civil but distant. Phone calls were brief. I'd built a new life that didn't depend on their approval or love. The most satisfying consequence wasn't their punishment but my freedom. I was finally, completely free from their manipulation. 6 months after the hearing, I sat in the newly opened office of the Tate Foundation for Family Support Services. I'd used a portion of grandmother's inheritance to create a nonprofit helping people navigate complicated family dynamics, estate disputes, and financial manipulation. Ms. Lorraine served on the board. Marissa provided pro bono legal advice to those who couldn't afford representation. We helped dozens of people who'd faced similar situations, family members trying to steal inheritances, siblings manipulating elderly parents, children being pressured to give up their rightful assets. Each case reminded me why I'd fought so hard. The foundation was grandmother's legacy and mine, combined. That morning, I received a card from Oliver, the associate who'd provided the crucial evidence. "Thank you for showing me that doing the right thing matters," he wrote. "You inspired me to start my own practice focusing on elder law and estate protection." I smiled, pinning the card to my office board. My life wasn't about revenge or punishing Dominic. It was about this, helping others, building something meaningful, choosing family wisely. I looked out the window at the city below, thinking about how far I'd come from that terrified woman frozen in the doorway. I'd reclaimed not just my inheritance but my life, my power, my future. And it felt absolutely perfect.